Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to talk to you about technical definitions, which are part of the everyday workplace. Often you're going to be asked to explain things to clients or to your coworkers, and the form that those explanations will take are definitions. Also, definitions will be part of your work life in terms of you might need to understand the definitions of things in order to complete your work task. So the example your book uses is a good one. Let's say, just to tweak it a little bit, let's say that your job says, we're going to give all employees money for any efforts at continued education. You would need to understand what qualifies as continued education in order to use this program, right? If I take a community college class at night, are they going to pay for that? Does that count as continued education? If I attend this seminar put on by the city government, does that count as continued education? What qualifies as continued education for them to pay for it, right? And so those kinds of questions and thinking through what the limits of something are or how something works or what it means is just part of your everyday life. We also encounter these all the time. They're in our textbooks, especially the parenthetical definitions and one-sentence definitions. They're all over our science textbooks and history textbooks. People defining for us a word or a phrase before carrying on. And then we see extended definitions all the time, like when you go to a Wikipedia page, that's often an extended definition. If you think you have an illness, the doctor says, oh, you might have blank, you might have pneumonia, you might have rheumatoid arthritis, and you go and you Google what rheumatoid arthritis is. That is an extended definition that comes up. So we encounter these all the time, and that's what you're going to write for us for this class this semester, okay? So there are 3 levels, and I want you to practice all 3. So the first level is a parenthetical definition, which just means a phrase or even a word in parentheses to define a word. You can also use what's called parenthetical commas, which is 2 commas taking the place of parentheses. And what you want to do is not put an entire sentence in the parentheses. You want to find a synonym that means the same thing that is more commonly known. So you would use if you can, just a one-word synonym or a small phrase. You would only get longer if there's not a simpler way to say it, okay? But a short 1 to 3 word parenthetical definition is better always than something much longer than that, okay? Your next level is a sentence definition, and a sentence definition always takes the same structure, and it goes a blank, whatever word you're defining, is, right? So a blank is always how it starts. And then you pick a category that you want to put it in, and then differentiate it from other things in that category. The category is a really important choice. So let's say I was defining a particular drug, right? A pill that you could buy on the that your doctor might prescribe for you, right? And I say a blank is, and I say a drug, right? So a blank is a drug, and then the rest of the sentence would explain how it's different than other drugs. But if I'm really thinking about how to communicate in one sentence what something is, I want to think carefully about how I can put my word in the most descriptive category possible and then differentiate it. So maybe I would say, instead of a drug, a narcotic drug. So a blank is a narcotic drug that, whatever. So that I'm narrowing it down to, this is a kind of narcotic. So now you understand a lot more about it already than you did in the first version, right? A drug, well, there's lots of drugs that do all kinds of things, right? And then I differentiate it from other narcotic drugs. Consider that to a blank is an illicit drug, an illicit drug, an illegal drug. I'm also narrowing it down into a smaller category. Drug, in this case, would have been a huge category that doesn't actually communicate that much about my term, whereas the category like a narcotic drug or an illicit drug already communicates something about my term before I go and differentiate it from other things in that category. So I want you to think carefully about the category that you're placing the term in, and then how to differentiate it from other things in that category. So if I was to describe it as a narcotic drug, the rest of the sentence would explain how it's different from other narcotic drugs instead of just different from other drugs, right? Which is a big task for one sentence. If I describe it as an illicit drug, how is it different from other illicit drugs, rather than trying to describe how it's different than all other drugs? So think about that category that you place it in, and is it the best descriptive category for your word? Okay, the last thing, and the thing I'll spend most of this video talking about, is your extended definition. Okay, an extended definition is what you're going to write for this project. And an extended definition, this is really important, always starts with a one-sentence definition. The very first sentence of your extended definition should be a one-sentence definition. So, in other words, your extended definition needs to start with a blank is, right, that structure. Then the rest of your extended definition is you picking a few strategies to explain it to a non-technical audience, a public audience. So basically imagine that you're picking a word that's really technical from your field or your profession, and that not everybody knows what this word means, and you are going to explain it so well and in such a way that if I pulled any college freshman or any adult off the street, they could read your definition and now they would know what the word meant. So you're not going to use words that only other engineers would know what that word even means, so they can understand your definition. Or, you know, if you're in whatever field, if you're in IT, only other words that other IT majors would use, so that I don't understand your extended definition because I don't understand a lot of the vocabulary you're using. Instead, you want to use language that everybody would understand. So you start with an one-sentence definition, and then you pick a few strategies, and you spend a few sentences or a paragraph on each of the strategies that you could use. So one strategy you can use is a graphic or an image. When we look in our science textbooks and they describe what a cell is, usually we see an image of what a cell looks like, a diagram. And importantly, if you choose to use an image or a graphic, you have to explain the image or graphic, just like you did with the report. You're not going to just put an image in there unexplained. You need to number it, you need to mention it, okay, in the paragraph, and you need to explain it. So in this diagram we see, or in this map we see, so on and so forth. So you're using an image to describe the things so people can understand what it means, what this term means. You can also use an example. So in your book, for example, they explain what hazing is by giving examples of what hazing might look like, right? You can explain what a protest is by explaining some of the more recent protests and how they worked and what they looked like, right? So sometimes giving an example from real life or giving an example of how this plays out in real life can help explain what that thing is, okay? So then another option is partition, and a lot of students have a hard time understanding this one, but partition is really useful if your word is actually made up of several categories or several types. Then you divide it into those categories or divide it into those types in order to explain what it is. So in the example in your book, how do I explain a virus? Well, let me explain the 4 main types of viruses. That's what partition is. So instead of trying to explain all viruses, you break it down into its parts or its categories in order to explain what it is. And that's partition. You can also explain principle of operation. This is good for something like a machine or some sort of chemical process. You would explain how it works in order to explain what it is. So for example, if I was going to explain the word metabolism, I might explain how metabolism works in order to explain what metabolism is. Okay? Now, the next 3 people kind of get confused back and forth, so I'm going to go over them. So compare contrast is when you take 2 things that are similar and explain what's similar about them and what's different about them. But they have to be the same kind of thing. So for example, here's a tree and here's another tree that people confuse with that tree, but let me explain to you how these trees are similar and how these trees are different so that you understand this tree, right? So 2 trees are very similar. They are the same thing, and I am comparing and contrasting 2 trees. Analogy is similar, but analogy takes 2 things that are not alike and compares and contrasts them essentially. So in your book, is a very good example of a brain versus a computer. In some ways, I can explain a brain or a computer very well by comparing it to the other thing. Oh, they both have electrical impulses. There's messages being sent along these electrical impulses, so on and so forth. And there are things that are similar about a brain and a computer, conceptually at least. However, in reality, a brain that is organic matter inside of our bodies is nothing like a computer that somebody made out of metal and plastic, right? They are not at all the same. So that's how an analogy works, is when you take something that is not like the other thing, really, but it helps you understand a concept about the other thing. So we can use analogy in order to explain something. So you might explain the flow of something to a river or whatever, but it's not actually anything like a river, right? So you're just thinking about a concept that helps you understand the other concept. It's similar to compare and contrast, but the difference is a compare and contrast is two actually alike things, and analogy is two actually, when we get really technical, not at all the same things. And negation is a lot like contrast, except negation is when you know that people are going to confuse your word with something and you just want to clarify how your word is not that thing people are immediately going to think it is. So for example, in your book, they use the example of an ambulatory patient. People hear ambulatory and they might think ambulance, but in fact, this has nothing to do with ambulances. An ambulatory patient, when you ask, is that patient ambulatory, what you're asking is, can they walk, not do they need an ambulance, right? And so you hear ambulatory and you might think ambulance, but it has nothing to do with ambulance. So you pick a word like that and you say, oh, I can imagine that a lot of you are going to confuse this with this because it sounds like that, but it's not. That's negation, okay? And then the last one is etymology. And etymology is when you explain the name of something in order to explain what it is. This is especially useful for acronyms. So for example, if I wanted to explain what NASA is, it would be helpful maybe to explain what the NASA stands for in order to explain what NASA is. Or TSA, what does the TSNA stand for in TSA in order to explain what TSA is? So that's useful. Also, if the word is like a mashup of two words and understanding the two words it originally came from might help understand what it is, that's useful. Or if the word comes from Latin or Greek and understanding what the Latin prefix means helps you understand what it is. We see this all the time all over our science textbooks. They'll often explain the Latin word for the scientific concept in order to understand the scientific concept. So that might be useful. Your job with this extended definition is to pick the strategies that make the most sense for the word that you have chosen to define. And you are going to organize it so that the most useful are first, right? You want people to understand in the first half of your definition, they already mostly understand it. And then the second half is just adding clarification and more interest. I don't want to get to the halfway point in your extended definition and still not have any idea what this is. So you want to go from most useful strategy to least useful, and that's up to you as a writer to figure out what that is, okay? And again, you want to keep a public audience in mind. You also want to keep that public audience in mind when you organize your technical definition in terms of its visual appearance. Some of you may choose to just have sort of paragraphs, but it may make sense in a lot of cases to have some subheadings or something to break up the page to help people understand your explanation. Think about when you go onto a website to explain a disease, how the information is broken up, or a Wikipedia page and the information is broken up. It is rare that an extended definition that we would encounter in the real world would be one giant blob of text. That's not effective communication. And remember, even back to the beginning of the semester, we always want to make it really, really easy for people to skim our information and still get what they need. So it's your job to impart it in a way that makes sense, that uses vocabulary that everybody would understand, and organize it in a way that helps them get the information in the quickest way possible. So that's your job for this project. We're going to have a peer review and then it's going to be due, okay? So I hope that the activities help you prepare to write this, but if you have any questions along the way, please, as always, do not hesitate to reach out to me. I'd be happy to help you, okay? Happy writing.